Donald Trump just spoke to Fox News about his relationship with President Obama. Listen to this.
It's a very strange phenomena. We get along. I don't know if he'll admit this, but he likes me.
How do you know he likes you?
I like him because I can feel it. You know, that's what I do in life. It's called, like, I understand. Now, we had a rough campaign. He was fighting better for Hillary than she did. He was vicious during the campaign toward me, and I was vicious toward him. We said horrible things about each other. And then we hop into the car, and we drive down Pennsylvania Avenue together. We don't even talk about it. Politics is amazing.
What'd you talk about?
We talked about the country. We talked about the future of the country. I asked him about what do you think our biggest problem is, and he told me, I can't tell you, but it's a problem. It's a military problem.
Yeah, that was the one thing he would not share, David. What's your reaction to the whole thing?
Well, I think that the country should be pleased that these two gentlemen have, from very different backgrounds, have developed some bridges between them so they can talk to each other. There are going to be moments, going to be crises in the history of this presidency, and when he may want to reach out to President Obama. I do think, you know, with all due respect to President Trump, I find that there are a number of business leaders I have the opportunity to talk to in New York, and almost to a person, they tell me, you know, I enjoy going out for lunch occasionally with Donald, or going out with Donald and Melania at night. He can be charming, he can be funny, and his company is fine, but they will not do business with him because it's a nightmare. And, you know, so that they have sharp disagreements about how to act with each other professionally, but beyond that, there is this sort of a you know, attraction about him that people find him, you know, interesting and good company frequently. So I would imagine that's what's going on here with President Obama. He's building bridges. He's keeping up a good relationship, but he obviously and sharply disagrees with almost everything that's been done in the last 2 weeks.
Do you respect Putin?
I do respect him.
Do you? Why?
Well, I respect a lot of people, but that doesn't mean I'm going to get along with him. He's a leader of his country. I say it's better to get along with Russia than not. And if Russia helps us in the fight against ISIS, which is a major fight, and Islamic terrorism all over the world,
right,
major fight, that's a good thing. Will I get along with him? I have no idea. It's very
He's a
possible
killer,
I
though.
won't.
Putin's a killer.
A lot of killers. We got a lot of killers. Why, you think our country's so innocent?
Even Republicans are perplexed, and some of them condemn those comments. Why do you think the president continues to praise Putin?
I think that I know this stirs up a lot of intrigue for people about Trump and Russia, because we've heard this throughout the campaign. If you look back at the last several years, if you go back, frankly, to 1990, a Playboy interview that Donald Trump gave then as a businessman 3 years after putting out The Art of the Deal, his first book, he has sort of consistently had words that are just purely strength weakness. That is how he views the lens through which he views the world. And he had this history in the campaign of praising people who are typically described as strongmen or dictators. You know, he described Saddam Hussein as, you know, a bad person, but he also was really good at killing terrorists, according to Trump. In fact, Hussein was against jihadists, but he also was considered a state sponsor of terrorism against Israel. He said that things were better with Gaddafi in charge. You know, he was sort of impressed with Kim Jong-un in terms of his rise to power. So this happened over and over again, and he praised the Chinese for the Tiananmen Square massacre in terms of showing strength.
These are all authoritarian figures.
Right, and so this is consistent, and also what you have seen with him in terms of his sort of personal criticism or delegitimizing criticism of a federal judge in the last couple of days, Judge Robart, in this executive order decision. Trump has consistently criticized judges. He has been involved in many, many lawsuits. I think that what you are seeing is somebody who has not necessarily, the presidency has not changed Trump so far. It might change him at some point, but so far we are very much seeing the same person he has been for a very long time. And I agree with David that I think that there are a lot of people who, when they see him and interact with him socially, they find him charming.
The White House now has released this list of terror attacks the president said the media is downplaying or not reporting on, right?
That's right, Anderson. I have it right here. 78 attacks since September of 2014. And the White House is careful to say that most of these attacks were not reported on adequately enough. But Anderson, just going through the list, there's no scoring system or grade system here to say, okay, these attacks were covered adequately, these attacks were not. And most puzzling of all, Anderson, inside this list, You see mentions of the Paris attacks where 129 people died, the San Bernardino terrorist attack, the Nice truck attack, and so on. And as you know, Anderson, these are all terrorist attacks that we covered days on end, not only here at CNN, but other international news outlets around the world. So this appears to be a talking point that is in search of a set of facts that just doesn't exist. The other thing we did not get an answer for is why the president made this claim today that the news media are not reporting on these attacks. He said, I think you know why, to those military commanders today. But no explanation was given as to why the news media would not report terrorist attacks. Given all of our coverage, it's just not true.
Jim Acosta, thanks very much. And keeping them honest, as Jim said, not only did we cover many of the attacks on that list the White House has released, we covered them heavily. I know because I was there on the ground reporting a number of them. 360 was in Ottawa, Canada, October 2014. That's on the list, where a gunman killed a reservist at the National War Memorial, where he was on duty at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. I was also in Orlando last June. That was on the list also, after 49 people were gunned down at the Pulse nightclub. I know because I flew there right after the news broke. December 2015, that was also on the list. San Bernardino, I was there. 14 people killed and 21 wounded in coordinated attacks. This was just a month after I reported on the carnage in Paris, where terrorists killed at least 130 people and wounded hundreds more in a series of attacks across the city. We're there pretty much all week. To be sure, we as a program did not cover each and every incident on the list. However, other programs, as well as CNN International, covered most, if not all of them, many of them exhaustively.
Congresswoman, the president hasn't just attacked the reasoning behind the decision, the travel ban decision. He's questioned the legitimacy of the judge himself, referring to him as a so-called judge in a tweet over the weekend. And as you know, the president made a similar attack on a federal judge last year when he questioned the legitimacy of Judge Curiel, who was born in Indiana because of his Mexican heritage. He was the judge involved in the Trump University case. Are you worried that the president's attacks on these federal judges represent a pattern of disregard for the judicial system?
I think that's exactly what it is, but it's even broader than that. I mean, this is, well, if you want to talk about the irony of all ironies, here is a man who attacked a civil rights icon, who said that questioned his legitimacy after this election. And then he turns around, and because he doesn't like a court's decision, he calls the judge a so-called judge. I mean, it's juvenile. It's actually an insult to actual juveniles to say that it's juvenile. I mean, I don't even know what category to put this in. It's a disturbing trend that we see from this president, whether it's on Twitter. And you know what? I think it's a great way to communicate with people. I'm not saying he shouldn't tweet if he wants to, but there's a certain amount of decorum that we expect from our president. He represents not just himself and his administration, but every single American. And I'm hoping that he recognizes that eventually and stops with the name calling and the attacking every time someone says, if it's a poll he doesn't like, if it's a comment that he doesn't like, if it's a court decision he doesn't like. That's part of life, right? You have to accept the good with the bad, and you have to roll with the punches. And so my hope is that as he gets longer in his tenure, he sees that there is a level of decorum that the president should assume, and hopefully he will.
President Trump's tweets are windows into his soul, unfiltered and often seemingly unmoored. This weekend, we all got to take quite a gander of Judge James Robart, a George W. Bush appointed federal judge who temporarily suspended the president's travel and immigration ban. President Trump attacked him as a, quote, so-called judge, seeming to question the judge's legitimacy and competence. Mr. Trump went on, just cannot believe a judge would put our country in such peril. If something happens, blame him and court system. People pouring in. Bad. Of the many polls suggesting that a majority of the American public opposes the travel ban, the president wrote, quote, any negative polls are fake news, just like the CNN, ABC, NBC polls in the election. Sorry, people want border security and extreme vetting. Let me read that one part of that again. Any negative polls are fake news. You got that? So any polling suggesting anything negative about the president or his policies is not, in his view, real. Of well-sourced stories reporting that the president did not know the extent to which his putting senior strategist Stephen Bannon on the Principals Committee of the National Security Council would be unprecedented and controversial, President Trump seemed to disagree. He opined, quote, I call my own shots largely based on an accumulation of data, and everyone knows it, some fake news media, in order to marginalize lies. All right, to sum up, if a judge rules against the president, he's a so-called judge. If a poll shows that a majority of you disagree with his policies, the poll is fake. If a well-sourced news story reflects something unflattering about him, that story is fake. So, the judicial branch of government and the free press, two fundamental pillars of our democracy, if we take actions he does not like, we are not legitimate. Okay, what about a known geopolitical foe of the United States, like, say, I don't know, Russian President Vladimir Putin? Well, coincidentally, the president was asked about Putin during yesterday's Super Bowl interview with Bill O'Reilly.
Will I get along with him? I have no idea. It's very
He's a
possible
killer,
I
though.
won't.
Putin's a killer.
A lot of killers. We got a lot of killers. Why, you think our country's so innocent?
Whoa, so as long as we all know where we stand, I suppose.
Well, good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Donald Trump's presidency is now in its third week, and the battle to push through his agenda is only escalating in its relentless ferocity. Tomorrow, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals will weigh whether to continue blocking the president's executive order on immigration. We'll discuss that order with Piers Morgan in just a minute. But first, with each passing day, the war between the press and the president grows more intense. Today, the president tweeted this: "The failing New York Times writes total fiction concerning me. They have gotten it wrong for 2 years and now are making up stories and sources." And this morning he tweeted this: "Any negative polls are fake news, just like the CNN, ABC, NBC polls in the election. Sorry, people want border security and extreme vetting." Well, one media outlet with a particularly antagonistic relationship toward the president is CNN, the cable news network, which Trump labeled fake news more than once. Piers Morgan is editor-at-large with DailyMail.com. He's the former face of CNN, and by the way, he won Celebrity Apprentice back when a certain future president was its host. He joins us now from L.A. Piers Morgan, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure. That just shows what good judgment he has, right?
Yes, and I always forget that, but what a cool thing to have on your CV. So I remember well when you were the face of CNN. I watched your show a lot. I didn't always agree with you, but I always thought you were straightforward. If you thought something, you just kind of put it out there and said it. So you left 3 years ago. Since then, thanks to WikiLeaks, we've learned a lot of detail about CNN colluding with the Democratic Party during this election. Were you shocked by it?
I was a bit, yeah. I mean, I don't know how directly involved CNN were, but I do know that when you looked at what happened with Donna Brazil and some of the other characters involved, it stank, frankly. And, you know, it brought to light, I think, Donald Trump's main beef with the media, which is that it's a two-way street, this question of respect and honesty. Yeah. And he has felt for quite some time, I think, that a lot of people in the mainstream media, for want of a better phrase, are absolutely determined to bring him down. And I think he's got a point. I think some of them absolutely are. And they were in the tank for Hillary Clinton. Their candidate didn't win. And now they are utterly determined to bring the Trump presidency crashing down. So you have a war between the media and the White House, the like of which I've certainly never seen before. And it's pretty dangerous all round.
So I think there's a difference, though, between having a perspective and stating it clearly, as you do, as I try to, and in a subterranean way that's cloaked from public view, coordinating with the political parties. So we learned in WikiLeaks the Donna Brazil story, as you know, where she got the debate questions ahead of time. We also found out that the DNC research director was consulted by CNN for questions to ask Ted Cruz. A Clinton staffer implied that the politics producer at CNN was, quote, a friend and an ally. And then you have the chief political analyst at CNN emailing John Podesta and saying, quote, "You are a TV star. I've been in GOP hell." I mean, it really seems like there is a special connection between CNN, not just all media, but CNN and that party. Did you notice that when you worked there?
Well, to be honest, and to be fair to CNN, you know, I spent 4 years there. I think the vast majority of people that work at CNN, particularly the anchors, do have great integrity, and I don't think they would want to be party to any of this kind of stuff. But I definitely think there were people lower down the food chain, perhaps, who didn't have such scruples and who were absolutely, I think, determined that Trump wouldn't win. And bear in mind that the history of this, from the moment that Donald Trump decided to run, you know, he was, for about 4 or 5 months, the only gig in town. CNN and all the other networks were racing to give him as much airtime as they could possibly give him. This, of course, fueled the monster. And then when the moment came when they thought, oh, God, hang on, he might actually win, then rather like Dr. Frankenstein, they thought, we've got to kill him off. But by then, Trump, the nominee, was gone. He was off and racing around America, and he became unstoppable. And I noticed in the last few months of that campaign, it got more and more virulent. You know, papers like the New York Times, frankly, I thought were a complete disgrace. They weren't even pretending to be anything but in the tank for Hillary Clinton. And I found that as a journalist pretty obscene to watch, actually. So for the New York Times and others now to be saying, oh, poor us, you know, we're the innocent parties here. Donald Trump is annihilating the media and breaking down the First Amendment and so on. It's pretty rich, I think, given the way that they themselves conducted themselves as the supposed paper of record. So I think that there is fault on both sides here. I think that it is dangerous and toxic, and I think that the media have got to start showing President Trump a bit more respect, and he in turn and his White House operation have got to show the media a bit more respect, and they've all got to move on.
Well, it's certainly within bounds, I think, for news organizations to call out politicians on statements that are false, and I think Trump has made a few, and I don't have any problem with reporters saying, whoa, wait a second, prove what you say. But it's the orientation that shocks me. It does seem like a lot of journalists see their role not as to report the news, but as to affect the outcome of an election. Has that changed in the decades you've been in the business?
Yeah, but look, I mean, you know, in Britain, for example, we have a very free press, and you have papers which are very obviously partisan to political parties, be on the left and the right. And it's pretty balanced down the middle. There are as many left-wing papers in Britain as there are right-wing. In America, what I don't like is this pretense from papers like the New York Times that somehow they are completely beyond any reproach when it comes to their coverage, that they are completely neutral. They're not neutral. I remember in the middle of the campaign picking up the New York Times and reading it from cover to cover. There were 11 different stories and letters and comment op-ed pieces about Donald Trump in that one edition of the New York Times. Every single one of them was hostile to Trump, including 4 out of 4 letters. Now, come on. That is not a coincidence. And I think what you're seeing generally here what we're seeing in Britain with the post-Brexit, you know, Britain leaving Europe.
Right.
And look, I did not vote Brexit. I voted to stay in Europe. I thought it was a mistake. But I've always been of a firm belief you have a free democratic election in a free democracy, be it the Europe referendum in Britain or be it the US election here. And if somebody wins, they win. You have to accept they have won. You have to stop the squealing, the wailing, the teeth gnashing. And what we're seeing in Britain, just as we're seeing in America, is just one of the great hissy fits of modern political times. And everyone's just got to stop wailing and actually start coming together, as we saw a little bit actually at the Super Bowl, and start putting America before their own self-interests.
Well, I mean, and by America, you mean the basic precept of the country, which is democracy, and the people administering the democracy, at least here and perhaps in Great Britain, they don't really believe in democracy, do they? I mean, the idea that the outcome is legitimate as long as the majority supports it.
Right. I mean, that is the essence of democracy. And I would be more left than right, as I'm sure many of your viewers would have gleaned from my time at CNN. You know, I'm absolutely not a traditional conservative. But I am appalled by the behavior of so many liberals right now. I just think it's so alien to the concept of being a liberal. They bang on about, you know, democracy. They bang on about tolerance, about fairness. And yet they're behaving exactly the same way that they warned us all that Donald Trump and his supporters would behave if and when, as they assumed, he lost. And I just don't think you can do that. I also think, knowing Trump as I've done for 10 years very well, it's completely the wrong way to go about trying to defeat him. If I was on the left, I would surely by now be trying to work out how have we lost to somebody like Donald Trump, who's a non-politician. He wasn't even a guy with any military experience. He's come out of nowhere as a business guy and a TV star, and he's become the President of the United States. How has that happened? And the reality is that for all the fancy talk about Barack Obama being this wonderful president, actually, in the polls before the election, over 70% of Americans said they were unhappy with the direction of the country. And Hillary Clinton was a terrible candidate who offered nothing new, nothing fresh. And I was doing a documentary series around Florida and Texas throughout last year. I spent a lot of time in those states, and I could feel the Trump phenomenon as it was happening in real time. And it really came down to this. They thought that Donald Trump cared about the stuff they actually cared about. And that's how he managed to resonate. And he won and he won fair and square. So my message to the left is, if you want to try and beat Donald Trump, then do it democratically and stop trying to delegitimize him. Stop trying to make every tweet, every statement, every comment he says the Armageddon of the world, and just try and apply some rational political common sense to defeating your opponent.
We seek that every night on this show. So I think a lot of Americans look to Europe and the UK and they say, it's changed an awful lot in the past 40 years. I know this as a regular visitor to your country and others. And it hasn't gotten better. And part of the reason it hasn't gotten better is because of the immigration policies in Europe. Those countries are more divided, they're more dangerous, they're less happy, and they're poorer. How do we, I know you're against the president's executive orders on immigration, but how do we prevent what's happened in the UK and Sweden and Germany and France from happening here?
Well, let me first of all say that I absolutely agree with Donald Trump that the threat from Islamic terrorism is very real and very dangerous. And he's quite right to cite what has happened in Paris twice, in Nice, in Brussels, as examples of where the massive amount of migration through Europe has created a lot of turmoil, a lot of unease, a lot of insecurity amongst the people, because no one's really quite sure who all these people are, where they're coming from, what their motivation is. So Donald Trump is absolutely right, I believe, to want to protect America as his #1 mission statement right now. And he's absolutely right to say that Islamic State presents a real and very dangerous threat to America. And he's absolutely right, thirdly, to look at what's happened in Europe and say, how do we avoid what has happened there, particularly in, say, Germany, with 1 million people being led into the country and then all hell breaking loose? How do we stop that coming to America? Where I disagree with him is just in the implementation of this ban, where it seemed to me perverse to not include countries like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and Egypt and others which foment so much terrorism. Also, I didn't like the idea of people with green cards being detained and threatened with deportation.
Well, it was
I didn't like the idea.
And they went back on that pretty quick. But so in just one
so there were things that were wrong about it. But this is the key point. I mean, for all those screaming at Donald Trump, you know, I say to them, well, okay, what's your idea? And the main idea from the left appears to be, we've all got to talk more to the community. Well, that's all fine. That's all fine. But while you're talking, ISIS are right now planning attacks on the British mainland, on the American mainland, and they've got to somehow be stopped. So I think Donald Trump is right in his concern, and he's just, I think, probably slightly wrong in the way he's executed this. But let's not all get so pious that we put the attack on Donald Trump and our hatred of him before the real threat, which is people trying to kill and maim and behead us.
That's a bracing reminder. Piers Morgan, thanks for joining us tonight. Thanks.
Pleasure.
Melissa McCarthy. Settle down! Settle down! Sure added spice to Press Secretary Sean Spicer. She began
by apologizing on behalf of you to me. And that apology is not accepted.
A sketch for the ages, tweeted one critic. Might be the best SNL skit ever, raved Glamour magazine. There's talk McCarthy could become a recurring character, though SNL wouldn't comment. The writers took Spicer's actual squabble over the phrase travel ban that President Trump himself used.
He's using the words that the media is using, but at the end of the day, it can't... Hold on.
The travel ban is not a ban, which makes it not a ban.
But you just called it a ban.
Because I'm using your words. You said ban. It's circular using of the word, and that's from you.
The actual Spicer, who's been known to hold up things, was portrayed using props.
Against radical Muslims.
Spicer has not been known to weaponize his podium.
Are you okay?
Come here. When asked about the skit, Spicer told Extra that Melissa McCarthy could dial it back a bit. He told Fox News.
It was cute. It's funny.
One personal quirk that SNL barely had to exaggerate.
I'm here to swallow gum, and I'm here to take nade.
I think Melissa McCarthy needs to slow down on the gum chewing. There's way too many pieces in there.
I'll get back to you.
Actually, Spicer told the Washington Post he chews 2.5 packs of Orbit cinnamon gum every day before noon.
That's 35 pieces, and he doesn't just chew them. He chews and swallows them.
And what spokesman wouldn't love to spout off like this?
What are you doing? What are you doing?
This is soapy water, and I'm washing that filthy lion mouth.
Jeannie Mer, CNN, New York.
Unhuman, what happened to us.
The visas were canceled apparently while they were flying in midair.
On the plane, all of us was very scared, and we don't know what happened. We played by the rules. We don't do anything wrong.
My family is here with us safe. We are so excited.
In a speech at U.S. CENTCOM headquarters today in Florida, President Trump said that radical Islamic terrorists are committing atrocities across the world and are determined to strike within the United States. True. But then he added this.
You've seen what happened in Paris and Nice. All over Europe, it's happening. It's gotten to a point where it's not even being reported. And in many cases, the very, very dishonest press doesn't want to report it. They have their reasons, and you understand that.
Joining me now to talk about it, my political panel, we have with us Republican strategist and pollster Kristen Isoltis Anderson, Washington Post columnist and associate editor David Ignatius, and White House correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, Carol Lee. David, he's alleging that the media doesn't cover terror attacks in Europe and that we don't want to. Do you have any idea what he's talking about?
No, and I have to be honest, as a journalist, I'm really troubled by that. We have brave colleagues who every day are taking big risks to cover these stories. Look at the New York Times, which the president demonizes often. The New York Times this weekend had an outstanding piece of reporting about how ISIS has been reaching out, is more involved in some attacks in Europe and abroad.
We're doing
a
version of that story later in the show with that reporter from the Times. Yeah.
It's particularly inappropriate when we have colleagues who are doing everything they can to bring this story to America, for the president to suggest that we don't take this story seriously. I'd love to sit down with them and go through. I have about 100 examples I'd like to show him.
I don't even understand it.
I think a lot of it has to do with Donald Trump views himself as being the voice of people who are very scared. And when people sort of feel like, well, there are all these things happening in Europe, and Donald Trump says that they're happening. Donald Trump validates that I should be afraid. I think that's a big piece of why this is in his message. This is why over the weekend he said if there's an attack in the United States as a result of this judge saying that my travel ban can't go into place, it'll be the judge's fault. That for him, a population that is afraid, that is deeply concerned about threats coming in from overseas, people causing attacks here in the United States, that benefits him, he thinks. And I think that's why he seeks to stoke this fear.
You know, it just occurred to me when you were saying that as to what this also might be, which is the Germans are very upset about the fact that there are all these fake news reports in Germany and throughout Europe of immigrants, refugees attacking European women and carrying out terrorist attacks. Clearly, first of all, let me just say, there are legitimate ones that happen, but there are a lot of fake ones, and that it explodes in social media, and then by the time the police and national security apparatus investigate, nothing happened, but the hysteria already got out there. Maybe he's talking about the fake news stories.
Potentially. I've asked the White House for some examples, so I'll let you know when they get back with some examples. I don't know what he is talking about, but this is another way in which, and I know we're only several weeks into this administration, this is so dramatically different from the Obama administration, which would say that journalists overcover these things and hype up the terrorists. And so it's kind of a little bit of whiplash. I don't know what he is referring to, but I do know that any news organization, when there's any kind of attack, we are all over that.
Yeah, and in fact, let me just read this, the White House spin. Sean Spicer, the press secretary, was on Air Force One. He was asked about this crazy quote, and he said that there are certain terror events, quote, that aren't exactly covered to a degree on which they should be. That was what the president meant, which of course is not what the president said. One thing I want to ask about also is what President Trump said to Bill O'Reilly about Putin. O'Reilly said, Putin is a killer. He said there are a lot of killers who think our country's so innocent. And David, here's what Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell told me about that quote yesterday. I'm trying to imagine your response if President Obama had defended the murderous reign of Putin by saying, you think our country's so innocent?
Well, look, I'm not going to critique the president's every utterance, but I do think America is exceptional. America is different. We don't operate in any way the way the Russians do.
Retired General Barry McCaffrey earlier today called the comment by President Trump about Putin comparing it favorably or at least equally with the United States un-American.
Senator McConnell's comment and McCaffrey's also suggests that Donald Trump is running out of runway with comments like this. These are so upsetting, so offensive to people in his own party. And I think that more and more, my focus as I try to cover this story of this presidency is on Republicans in Congress. They're the people who are going to have to draw clear lines, say this is unacceptable, this does not speak for our party, for our country. And to the extent they do that, I think there's some protection. If they don't, I'm worried.
I want to ask you, because you're a pollster, and President Trump said today, any negative poll is fake news.
I almost enjoy the honesty of that tweet because, frankly, look.
You're such a positive person.
I'm trying to be chipper. Look, you can say, I think the polls are bad. I think the polls are broken. I think the polls can't be trusted. Those are valid statements to make. That's a debatable point. Saying, I only distrust the negative polls is not actually a position that is tenable, but frankly, that is the position that he holds. So kudos to him for being at least honest about it. I think there's a lot that the polling industry needs to do to figure out how we can regain trust, how we can make sure that people believe the numbers that we're putting out. But you can't just say only the negative polls are bad. That's not how it works.
Well, and the same thing with the work we do. The negative stories, the unflattering stories are fake, he says.
Yes, this is a pattern. I mean, Donald Trump is a president who needs an opponent. There's always an opponent. The polls are the opponent, the media is the opponent. You know, whoever it is that's getting in his way, the judge is the opponent, and that's the way he sees the world, and that's where a lot of this stuff is coming from.
You were talking about Republicans in Congress. The checks and balances that we have set up in the system, the freedom of the press and the press being one of them, but also, of course, the judicial branch, which some people think is now under attack because of his comments about the Judge Robart. There's a legislative branch. Are members of Congress afraid of him? Do they think that they're next in terms of trying to undercut them?
Well, it depends on how popular he is. I mean, members of Congress kind of go with the political wins. His polls are down, and I think that's going to embolden members of Congress. We're going to see how strong our system is. We're going to see whether the checks and balances work. I have been tremendously encouraged by rulings like Judge Robart's. It shows that we have rule of law. That's what we pride ourselves on, but it's going to be tested.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how long Republicans can you can almost see in your interview with Senator McConnell, they're just like, he keeps putting them in these very uncomfortable positions.
Exactly. When McConnell came on the show, he just wanted to talk about Judge Gorsuch.
Right.
But from the time we booked the interview until the time he did the interview, there were, 50 sprays of crazy.
And there's a number of things that you've seen Senator McConnell say where those of us in Washington can tell it's like McConnell's hair is on fire, even though it doesn't sound that way, because he's so subdued. And a number of things that Trump has said have led to that, including that.
Great panel. Thanks for being here, one and all. Appreciate it.
He also spoke about what he called the very dishonest media. Once again, I want you to listen to Sean Spicer on Air Force One on the flight back to Washington. He was questioned about that.
That story was so riddled with inaccuracies and lies that they owe the president an apology for the way that thing was. There were just literally blatant factual errors, and it's unacceptable to see that kind of reporting or so-called reporting. That is literally the epitome of fake news.
Part of that story was the detail.
You'd start at the top. I don't think the president owns a bathrobe. Definitely doesn't wear one.
Now, he was referring to a story in the New York Times today in which it mentioned the president wearing his bathrobe at night, was talking about what was going on inside the White House.
Well, I should say that our friend Jake Tapper has already emailed around a picture of Donald Trump wearing a bathrobe. Now, it was many decades ago, so perhaps it's not with him anymore, or maybe it doesn't fit or whatever, but it does exist. But are we really having this conversation about whether it's Donald Trump and bathrobes, or more importantly, it gets to the core, and this is actually, I'm joking, but this is very serious. I can say you can attack the media every time you don't like something. You can, and he does. And he has the freedom to do that, just like we have the freedom and the responsibility, I should say, to try to report out what is happening in this country. But, like, come on. At a certain point, it's going to be like even people who support him and cheer him on for that are going to be like, we don't want to hear it anymore. Just do your job.
Quote, once you have found the car, look at the front right tire. You'll find the keys placed on top. Open it and retrieve the bag. This is just one of the chilling messages sent to new ISIS recruits from the terror group's virtual mentors, thousands of miles away, according to the New York Times. In a recent report, journalist Rukmini Callimachi shows that not all of these so-called lone wolf attacks were in fact by lone wolves. She found the terrorists using encrypted apps and explicit instructions to expand their reach from Syria and Iraq to online followers around the world.
They basically just reach over the internet into our communities, and then almost like a puppeteer pulling the strings of a puppet, they maneuver that person towards the attack. They will sometimes provide everything down to the bullets that the person needs to use to kill victims.
Officials and analysts are not describing these actions as ISIS-directed or ISIS-inspired. They're known instead as ISIS-enabled plots, such as the one carried out in a Bangladesh cafe last year that left 22 dead. And the 2015 shooting in Garland, Texas, where the would-be terrorists were killed. Since 2015, Callimachi reports, at least 10 ISIS-enabled plots have been carried out, from Indonesia to Paris to Germany and the United States. For ISIS, these are cheaper, easier directives, often discovered only after the suspects are caught. Interrogation transcripts obtained by the New York Times provide a trove of details.
These are interrogation transcripts that show both what the attackers who survived the attacks said to police, and also detailed reports of what was found on their smartphones and on their laptops.
In 2014, ISIS sought to enable an attack in Hyderabad, India. Indian investigators said the ISIS recruit later detailed 17 months of instructions from virtual plotters.
The ISIS handler, who we now know was sitting in Syria, arranged for several drops of weapons and chemicals that were going to be used in this attack, and they were left in locations that ranged from a tree to a package that was to be left next to a railroad track, to an overpass, to a canal.
Some recruits are swept up by murderous mentorship even faster. On Christmas Day 2015, Emmanuel Lutkeman of Rochester, New York, reached out to ISIS online.
Within 6 days, he was moved from talking to the handler to agreeing to do an attack to going to Walmart to buy the axe that he was going to use.
Thankfully, Lutkeman was captured before he was able to carry out his plans. Intelligence officials continue to hone in on this new trend in terror, hoping to foil more plots before they're carried out.
Wolf, we heard the president earlier today talking tough on terror. President Trump is once again lashing out at the news media as well. Today, in front of a military audience at the U.S. Central Command in Florida, the president accused the press of intentionally downplaying terrorist attacks. The president did not specify which attacks he was referring to in his remarks, but here's what he had to say.
All over Europe, it's happening. It's gotten to a point where it's not even being reported. And in many cases, the very, very dishonest press doesn't want to report it. They have their reasons, and you understand that.
Page brief, please.
Now, asked for an explanation of the president's comments, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer told reporters Mr. Trump believes terrorist attacks are not covered to the degree he would like them to be. Spicer also said, Wolf, that the White House would provide a list of attacks that they believe warranted more coverage. But, Wolf, as we know, these claims strain credulity, as terrorist attacks are always covered as major breaking news around the globe. So it's not exactly clear what the president is referring to in this case.
Joining me now is Senator Pat Leahy of Vermont, former chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee and a Democrat. Senator, thanks so much for joining us. I want to play something for you that the president said this afternoon at CENTCOM. Take a listen.
You've seen what happened in Paris and Nice. All over Europe, it's happening. It's gotten to a point where it's not even being reported. And in many cases, the very, very dishonest press doesn't want to report it. They have their reasons, and you understand that.
Senator, I know you're not a spokesman for the Trump White House, but I'm just wondering, do you have any idea what he's talking about?
I have no idea, and I think I'm going to go back and reread George Orwell. I mean, this kind of doublespeak makes no sense at all. And look what the president has done. He's made it very clear he doesn't want Muslims in our country. He issues an executive order that is so broad on its face, we could be blocking people from virtually any country, including just tourists coming into the United States. He tells a federal judge, or tells the country, well, this federal judge disagrees with me. He's obviously not a valid federal judge. He said the same thing about another judge who found that he had been involved in business dealings he should not have been involved in. In other words, if you agree with him, you're valid. If you disagree with him, you're invalid. And then he doubled down this weekend, basically equating Putin's Russia as a moral equivalency with the United States of America. I don't know how anybody, Republican or Democrat, could accept that. Bill O'Reilly, to his credit, raised Putin and what he does. A man who's ordered assassinations, has had the members of the press assassinated, political rivals assassinated, has stolen tens of billions of dollars from his country, and he says that's equivalent to the United States? No, it is not.
The tweet about Judge Robart, in which he called him a so-called judge, I've talked to people who defend Trump and say, look, this is just him insulting a judge. It's no big deal. You disagree?
Oh, it's a huge deal. To use his words, it's a huge deal. And I'll tell you why. We have three branches of government. One of the reasons our democracy is now the oldest existing democracy in the world is because we have checks and balances between legislative branch, judicial branch, and executive branch. Every single president, I've been here since President Ford, whether they agree or disagree with a court order, they say, okay, it's got to be upheld. That's what we do. We've never had a president of either party try to undercut and lower the moral authority of our federal courts. It's just never been done. And I've had a lot of Republican senators say, this goes beyond the pale.
So many Trump voters might say that this is exactly why they voted for him, to send him to Washington, to shake things up, to take on these out-of-control judges, etc. What would your response be to them?
My response would be he took an oath, a very solemn oath, to uphold the Constitution. You don't uphold the Constitution by saying the courts are not valid. You're not upholding the Constitution when you say the murders and the bribery in Putin's Russia are the moral equivalent of the United States of America. That, I can't imagine anybody who would vote for a president to do that.
So you say you're not voting for President Trump's nominee to be Attorney General, Senator Jeff Sessions. He was a state Attorney General. He's been a colleague of yours in the U.S. Senate for years. Surely you don't think he lacks the qualifications to be Attorney General?
I think part of the qualifications is what will you do with the Attorney General? Remember, he was a man who voted against a very simple resolution that says we do not have a religious test in the United States. I was certainly brought to believe that. I thought everybody was. He voted against the Violence Against Women Act because we included Native Americans and immigrants in the LGBT community, as well as the sexual trafficking of children. It passed overwhelmingly in the Senate and the House. He thought it went too far.
What do you want to hear from President Trump's Supreme Court pick, Judge Neil Gorsuch, who seems to have supporters, both Democrats and Republicans?
I'll sit down and talk with him. I want to know how independent it'd be. I was worried about the way he was announced. The president did it like it was some kind of a game show. I'm flying in the two final contestants, and now open the door, and here's the one I picked. The Supreme Court is not a reality show. It's the U.S. Supreme Court. And you get especially troubled when he says that he picked the name from vetting done by right-wing organizations, many of them lobbying organizations, that they would tell the president whom he could pick. That's not the way we do it. I voted for a lot of judicial nominees of both Republicans and Democrats, from the Supreme Court down through. I voted for them thinking they would be independent, not beholden to some special lobbying group.
All right, Senator Pat Leahy, Democrat of Vermont, thank you so much. Appreciate it, sir.
Thank you.